Hi, so here we go with another tutorial. This time I'm going to be talking about the rigid bodies. There's simulation tools that you have within Blender. Here I have a scene where I'm just going to show you the basic rigid body stuff. I have a cube. I've already moved it up 1 meter, and now I'm scaling it to make it kind of look like a domino, and then I'm using an array modifier to repeat that cube. And then I'm adding a plane, so you can kind of see where I'm going with this. I move it over. So first I'm taking the plane and I'm making it a rigid body that's passive, and then the dominoes, I'm making it a rigid body that's active, and then I'm applying that array modifier and then going into edit mode and separating all the loose parts. So then I have each object is its own thing, and then I change the origin to geometry for all of them, and I'm rotating one, and you can see as soon as you turn on the rigid body, it just acts like you would expect. A set of dominoes is affected by gravity. So that's easy enough, and you can set up a lot of kind of cool simulations with this. I have another video where I go into using this with the cell fracture, and that's kind of neat. And there you can make like a window breaking and flying apart. And here I'm starting to show you some of the rigid body constraints. And I have two objects here. There's an icosphere and then there's cylinders. I'm making a little wind chime. And then I have a bunch of empties there. And you can see that the icospheres are passive and the cylinders are all active rigid bodies. And then the constraints are actually on these empties. So if I go up to the empty, and here I'm just animating another cylinder so that it intersects all the other ones and kind of makes a wind chimey kind of thing. And you'll see the animation later. So here I'm using this point constraint, and what that basically is, it's kind of a universal joint. It is free to rotate in all directions, but held in translations. So the connections between these two objects, the icosphere and the cylinder, for each one, and then if I play the animation, well, there it goes. They're all free to rotate and bang up against each other, and kind of like a little wind chime. So that's my introduction to like what you can try and do with these rigid body constraints. And there's a lot of options in there. You can see there's a fixed option, and what that does, it locks the two objects together. So if I start a new scene and I copy this cube, and then let's go ahead and add an empty. I can kind of move that in between. And then if I click that, it's give me an error, and what it is there's no rigid bodies. So I click on the two cubes, make them rigid bodies, they're both active. Click on the empty and make the two objects for a fixed constraint, those two cubes. And then let's move it up, maybe rotate it a little, and then let's add a plane and make that passive rigid body object. So then when I do that, let me go ahead and play the animation. And you can see they're kind of locked together. They act as one rigid body that's all just fixed together, exactly what it says it does. So then let's take this and make it breakable. And what does that do? Well, there's a threshold there, and you got to kind of play around with it. Here, it's not reaching that threshold, so I'm lowering it. And then let's try that animation again, and well, they're still fixed together. But if I lower it even more, and then let's restart that animation, you can see they break finally. So you can set up a series of objects that are all collected, and when there's a force that's above a certain threshold, they break apart. So you can use that in like with a cell fracture, and you can have the object fracture, but only some pieces actually break off, which is kind of interesting. If I take these two cubes and line them up and then scale them down, and this is going to be the hinge constraint. I'm going to go ahead and apply the scale. Sometimes if you don't apply scale, things kind of act weird in the rigid body simulations. And so hinges, they doesn't really say it, but you can see there's a Z angle there. So it's actually putting a constraint in the Z axis. So you can see as here I kind of messed up and I rotated the two objects, but not the coordinate system. I mean the empty. And you can see it's kind of acting a little weird. So what I had to do is go ahead and line those up so that they were all together, and then I rotated the whole group, and then go ahead and animate, and you can see it acts like a hinge. Now the next one I'm going to show you is the slider. So I set up a few cylinders. I have two on the ends. I made them passive. I have one in the middle that's active, and then I have a coordinate system, the empty. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and use another cylinder to impact that active cylinder. And so here I am animating it just so that I get some impact into that, so you can see kind of what happens. And you can see all it does is it moves right along that x-axis. Now I did a different one where I got a cube and I kind of dropped it on the cylinder, and you can see that when the cube is dropped, the only thing it wants to do is move in that x direction. And if you notice, there's no rotation, it's just translation in the x. And that's really the only difference between the slider and the piston. The piston will actually allow you to rotate, and you can see it's rotating here. Now, the other option in there, there's a generic, which is just some generic connections. And it seems to me that it works best if you have two objects and they're just connected to each other directly. I was playing around here with having it connected to an empty, and it behaves just kind of strangely. So I fixed that by actually... So here I have a simulation where I just have a generic constraint, and I didn't set any limits. And you can see as it goes up, it just kind of swings around. So it's kind of like a slider and hinge kind of combination. And here, if I make a generic spring, that's actually got some spring information down below, and you can see it's kind of bouncing around as if it's connected by a spring. So the next one I'm going to show you is the motor. And the motor is kind of interesting. What you need to do is make sure that you have two objects and that you're using what you need is two objects, and you want to make sure that you have an empty in between. So here I'm playing around with the motor, and what I did there, I put in a gear, and if you want to see where you can get the gears from, there's a Mesh Extra Objects tutorial that I have. You can go ahead and take a look at that. And I have an empty, and the empty, I have a rigid constraint that's a motor, and it's between the plane and the gear. And you can see I have to rotate that so that X is in the axis that I want to rotate in order for that to begin rotating about the axis that I intended it to. And there's also an option for linear, and that's the same thing as this angular, only instead of being angular, it's a linear motion. So there's two options there for the motor, and you can adjust the velocity, and the impulse makes it that's the strength of the motor, how quickly it can kind of ramp up its speed. So that's kind of interesting, and there's some tutorials online. You can see there's one guy that has, I'll probably put a link there in the description. He had a really cool setup using all these rigid constraints with a car, and it's really clever, and kudos to him for a great job on that. So that's it. If you like the video, please go ahead and click like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.